So, welcome to another special edition of Intersections, and welcome to our continuing consideration of the situation in the Ukraine. I'm very happy today to have as my discussion partner and expert source of expertise, Dr. Tom Singer, who is both a psychiatrist and a Jungian psychoanalyst, who has pioneered the notion of cultural complexes. He's a prolific author, has done a great deal to extend the body of knowledge that is Jungian analytical psychology in new areas that have to do with politics, that have to do with culture, that have to do with our sense of what vision means in the modern world. And I believe that that perspective is very valuable when it comes to trying to understand what is, I think, fundamentally not understandable in terms of this war that's going on right now between the Ukraine and Russia. So much of the rhetoric, especially interestingly enough on the Russian side, has made reference to cultural beliefs that go back literally 1,000 years. The conflict is woven with not just contemporary political and social ideologies, but with the role of religion, the position of the Orthodox Christian tradition in the desire of the leader of Russia to reunite the peoples of Greater Russia who are one people. And meanwhile, you have other leaders thinking other kinds of thoughts. And it's pretty obvious that those thoughts don't necessarily connect. It's not that common for people in leadership positions to have a great kind of psychological acumen as well, which is why we've brought in Dr. Tom Singer this morning to help us try to understand. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I look forward to seeing if we can make any headway with these unbelievably complex and fundamentally irrational issues from a psychological perspective, which, in my opinion, leaks into the political and international relations. Your comment about politicians not necessarily being the most astute people when it comes to psychology that in itself is a complex statement, because politicians often have an intuitive reading of the psyche of the people that they're dealing with and perhaps of their enemies. And so they're very good at playing to that, but not necessarily with what we might think of as a psychological consciousness. So they're good at manipulating what I think of as cultural complexes, but not necessarily having a real psychological attitude about them. They have a political attitude about psychological issues.
Well, that's going to be something we're going to want to unpeel as well, because obviously there is a psychological subtext, an individual psychological subtext that, you know, on the one hand, we wouldn't presume to put on the couch people we've never met. And you can speak to that with regard to some of the writings you've done about our previous president. But, you know, we have a leader in Russia, we have a leader in the Ukraine, we have a leader in the United States, just to pick three non-random players. And each one of them carries this kind of psychological penumbra of psychological phenomena around them in terms of how they're perceived, how they perceive each other, what their personas are like in the media, and so forth and so on. So I'm sure we'll get into that as well. So I think it would be useful for our audience to understand at a very, I want to say almost basic level, what a cultural complex is and why it's a useful lens for looking at, let's say, world events.
Yes, I'll try to be concise and clear about a phenomena that's neither clear nor concise. I've been working on the notion of cultural complexes for 20 or 30 years and collaborated with colleagues around the world. I think we've done 5 or 6 books in almost every region of the world except the Middle East, which is really hard to get people who are willing to think through that lens. So the notion of a cultural complex grows out of Jung's original work with complex theory, which is that we all have complexes. That's a naturally occurring psychological phenomena, and we know that in lay language through an inferiority complex or a power complex. The language of complexes is sometimes very familiar to people, although Jung had a psychological definition of it. And basically, he uncovered this notion, if you will, through his original word association test when he noticed that certain kinds of trigger words cause significant delays in the reactions of people because there was deep emotion that was triggered by that particular word, like mother or father. I've extended this notion of the personal complex to what I call cultural complexes, which are complexes that are part of the group life for small or large groups of people, including nation states have complexes, which one can study. And often these complexes are built on, as you just said, 1,000 or 2,000 years of experience or 300 years of experience. They tend to be long-lived cultural complexes. They tend to accumulate information and historical data that validates their own point of view and is unable to consider anything other than how they see the world. So they have very long-term memories that are selective, often unconscious, and therefore are subject to enormous distortions over time. They tend to be repetitive in the sense that the same cultural complex in a group keeps occurring over and over again. What's closest to home in the United States, of course, is the complex around race. That's our most vexing, intractable complex. The experience of Black people has 300 or 400 years of history, and it keeps accumulating new experience that validates its own point of view, whether you're white or Black. Another thing about complex, not only do they show themselves through the intensity of the emotions that are triggered when you enter into a complex, but the thinking of a complex tends to be very simplistic, black and white. When you're caught in a cultural complex, you're probably not going to be able to think in very subtle terms. They have very specific ideas about one's own group and other groups who are one's rivals. Those are some of the basic aspects of a complex. They tend to function in an involuntary and autonomous way. That is, they have a life of their own in the ongoing life of the group. And not only do cultural complexes live in the group, they live in the individual members of the group. So that to talk about a cultural complex is not to say that an individual is not a carrier of that cultural complex. It's a different level of the psyche. And then the final thing I would say is that this is the sort of Jungian piece, which is we imagine them to have archetypal cores, that is, some deep beliefs or assumptions about the nature of what we call the self or the center of one's being. In an individual, there can be an archetype of the hero, for instance, or whatever the archetypal content is. The notion is that complexes are built around archetypal realities. That may be a bit much to say right now, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that in terms of Putin and yeah.
Putin and co. So it might be helpful to have some more examples of cultural complexes, and also examples where cultural complexes have evolved into being less compulsive and unconscious and destructive, if such exist in the literature. I think talking about the theory or the framework is one thing, but if you can talk a little bit about some other examples. You mentioned race, and what would some others be?
Yeah, I think the one that's actually been most interesting to me in terms of witnessing in our lifetime a profound transformation in the complex would be about homophobia and gender. I think that if you look at the history of homophobia, it's what, 2,000 years, at least 3,000 years, the general cultural conventional attitude to homosexuality among men and women has been unbelievably negative and virulent for a long, long time. And what we've witnessed in our own lifetime, and this cultural complex of homophobia has all sorts of the reactions to it. The emotions are very powerful. The attitudes, the thoughts that go along with it are very simplistic. It accumulates its own memories about how terrible it is. There's a long history of the homophobic cultural complex. What's been amazing in our lifetime is how dramatically that's changed. That's quite unusual, actually, to witness such a radical change in the hold that a cultural complex has on a large group of people.
Well, it hasn't changed. I agree with you. And at the same time, it hasn't changed in certain parts of the world. Like in Russia, the head of state is obviously on that kind of homophobic spectrum. China has actually come out very explicitly, the government, as championing a kind of, I hesitate to say toxic masculinity, but at least masculine masculinity. We're seeing this in Texas and other places right now in terms of the arguments about transgender children and whether that's merciful medicine or horrible abuse. So the complex is still alive, although I agree that in our civil society here, it is remarkable how attitudes have changed. So it is possible then for complexes to be, if not resolved, at least to evolve.
I think it is. I think it's more likely that they don't evolve. I think it's more likely that they're unchanging from generation to generation and they get passed on. I'm not arguing for a genetic transmission, but there is a transmission of complexes from one generation to the next. And it's more usual for them to persist and endure over time than to evolve and change. Jung said about personal complexes that we need to drink them to the dregs. And the same, of course, would be said of a cultural complex. For it to be transformed, one needs to take it in and digest it. And that's a very long, difficult process, both for an individual, and you could amplify that for a culture. So the examples you cite about Russia and China and many parts of the world, that's actually what you would expect about a cultural complex.
When you say drink it to the dregs, what do you mean? Do you mean encountering it, holding it in consciousness, examining it, getting therapy for it? I mean, what did he mean by that?
Well, I think what he meant, first of all, if you drink something to the dregs, it means that it goes way deep and you've got to drink all of it, which I think means a kind of conscious digestion process, not an intellectual digestion process, but an emotional and psychological digestion process. And the easiest example that comes to mind is a senior analyst in our tradition. Her name was Elizabeth Osterman, and she said she had a particular negative complex which went untouched for about 30 years. It dominated her life. And now when it comes up, which was a kind of self-righteousness and opinionated self-righteousness that was dictatorial, she said now when it comes up, it maybe lasts for about 5 minutes. The affect of it and the feeling of it and the behavior that grows out of it. So that drinking to the dregs means that you don't get rid of it altogether, but you gain more emotional awareness of how it functions in you. And with that consciousness, you're not as identified with it. And so, say, in a cultural complex of homophobia in the United States, at least, we all can have very deep emotional responses to homosexuality, but we've experienced either in ourselves or in the world around us or with friends or whatever, that it's quite different than our complex may tell us.
Yeah. And we have a member of the U.S. cabinet is I mean, that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago,
That
30
would
years
have been,
ago.
yeah, that's exactly right. That's a perfect example that something has shifted in the cultural complex, if you will, that's permitted us as a people, as a large group of people, to have a different attitude. That's quite remarkable, really.
Mhm. Okay, so maybe we should shift gears. And now that we've established a sense of the cultural complex in general, how would you use it as a lens for understanding what's been going on in the Ukraine and what's been going on in this kind of relationship between the Ukraine and Russia?
Well, let me take a slight diversion, if possible. If you have I made an image of the archetypal defenses of the group spirit. I'm wondering if you have that, because it's a visual way of demonstrating it, and I can very easily translate that, I think, from what's going on, what went on with Osama bin Laden and George Bush, to what's going on with in Russia and Ukraine. I'm not sure if you can pull that image up or not.
Yeah, I just need a second to
Yeah.
position it,
So
since
sometimes an
Zoom
image.
is a highly perfect medium. But here we go in just a second. How's that?
It's good, except the image, at least on my screen, you've only got the upper half of the image. Is there a way of making it smaller so that the entire image can show, or uh, uh, or or scroll it down or something, make the image smaller?
Oops. Well, I can scroll it like this, I guess.
All right. Why don't you just do one quick scroll of the image, and then we'll start at the top.
We have a nuclear flare. We have the Twin Towers, George Bush, Osama bin Laden.
That's
Islam.
Baghdad going up in flames on the left of your screen.
Oh, that's the shock and awe.
Yes, that's right, John.
And then we have, American flag memorials.
And we have two serpents in the middle, and I'll explain that in the middle. And then we have individuals who are, in a sense, the carriers of the complex. And then we have the cultural backdrop of the complex, which is actually the Crusaders and the Muslims having a fight in Jerusalem. I think it's Jerusalem, but it's the long history of the conflict of the. So if we go up to the top, what I'm trying to indicate with this, oh, that's good. That's good, John. Well done. Yeah, there it is. There it is. Good. Okay. So when you're trying to understand a cultural complex in a international conflict on the scale that we're experiencing in Ukraine and Russia, and with all of the Western world involved and China's involved, you have all these groups being drawn into this thing. And at the very top of the image is the kind of background of what is both the fear and the threat of the thermonuclear war. That's the kind of if you will, the radioactive background of this conflict is the potential for a nuclear conflagration. And that's what terrifies everybody, and what Putin is using as a weapon of terror, if you will. You have the two leaders. In this case, I'm going to but just because this is a visual demonstration as a way of thinking about it, you have the two leaders who become the carriers of the ideology, of the conflict, and of the cultural complexes. And on either side of them, you see the massive destruction that's carried out through the orders of these leaders. If you just put Zelensky and Putin, you just substitute them. I'm actually in the process of working on an image for this phenomena. For now, I haven't quite gotten there yet. I've been collecting images. The next level down, John, is those are two serpents that are in opposition to one another. And this is a representation of what in our tradition we call the archetypal level, which would be the shadow images of human beings. And in this kind of conflict we're experiencing right now, you get the deepest archetypal energies of hatred and hostility and rivalry being activated. And they're being activated in the name of core values. And so if you look at either side of the two serpents, on the left-hand side, you see in the core value or the core spirit of the group is the Muslim faith. And what's happened to the Middle East over the last 500 years or so, which has been a really steady devaluation of its place in world affairs, although, of course, oil has shifted all of that. But the Muslims have a deep 500-year history, an inferiority complex, if you will, because they've been battered by the West in all sorts of ways. And on the right, you have the core value of the United States, the God of the United States, if you will, which is the idea of the exceptionalism of the United States and the fundamental values of liberty and freedom and everything that we hold to be most important to us. And what happens in these conflicts is that when those core values are being threatened, as happening in both Ukraine and Russia now, this serpent or shadowy archetypal energies get activated and expressed through the leadership in the most destructive kind of outbreak of violence. And then what happens at the next level is that individual citizens, you and I, become carriers and act out the core, the cultural complex. We become so on the left, you see the jihadists about to assassinate a Japanese, about to behead a Japanese reporter. And on the right, you have Abu Ghraib, where we've got our attack dogs going after the prisoner, so that individuals become carriers of the activated cultural complex. And then the image at the bottom, John, is of the long history of the conflict between the Christian, Judeo-Christian world and the Muslim world. And that's got a 1,000-year history, about 1,000-year history. So that lower image, in a sense, is the source of these ancient rivalries which get activated in contemporary events. So if we took that as a model of what happens when a cultural complex gets activated in this virulent way, we can almost begin to put the pictures in place here. I'll stop, but I talked a lot, and maybe you have some questions or thoughts.
Well, I think it would be great to actually take this lens now and comment on what's going on right now in the Ukraine. I mean, the thing that strikes me about this this graphic is that there's a certain symmetry between George Bush, who literally talked about going on a crusade, and Osama bin Laden and so forth and so on. I mean, there's a lot of political and historical and social subtext here. But I'm wondering how that plays out if we're looking at, is it Zelensky versus Putin? Is it Putin versus Biden? And how the notion of the cultural complex helps us in terms of beginning to understand what's going on. Because I think we would have to say, for the most part, that it's not like there are two aggressors who are meeting in the middle on the field of battle. I mean, one country attacked another country, and so the violence and the shadow and so forth and so on, amplified by control of information and so forth and so on, is on one side. And then on the other side, the reaction, which is also amplified by media and so forth and so on, is about the righteous David versus Goliath, who has moral strength on their side, and there's an enormous amount of truth to that. Although at the same time, what we're trying to do here is to kind of decode it from a macro psychological cultural complexes point of view. So how would you then connect what we've been talking about to what's going on in current events?
Well, of course, that's the most important question, and I'll
$64 question here.
and I'll answer it as best I can with the provision that I don't know exactly. I don't know, for instance, if the symmetry that's displayed in that image is exactly the same as in current. I don't pretend to say they're the same. I do think that in both cases, cultural complexes are fueling the conflict. There's no question in my mind about that. If you look at the deep emotionality, the reactive emotionality, if you look at historic memory, self-selecting historic memory being mobilized on both sides to fuel the media propaganda assault, if you look at the way that these things have kind of are functioning autonomously, it's like they have a life of their own in the collective psyche. All of those things, I think, are playing out in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. But of course, it's not the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. It's Russia and the West. And then we have China looming on the side, so that this is it's an international, it's truly a global conflict with global repercussions and shifting global alliances that are very fluid right now. Right now, it looks like there's a very unified Western response of the Western world, including some non-Western countries as well. We don't really know where India is. We really don't know where China is. So these things are never black and white as you try to outline them. But on the side of the Russian experience, if we look at Putin, and we're only getting glimpses into his psychology now, he's been kind of a black box for a long time, and unlike Trump, and I participated, as you know, in a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, we had decades of public pronouncements from Donald Trump that gave us a lot of insight into his psychology.
We do have a 5,000 word broadside from Putin that is the rationale for the war. And, he gave this kind of ranty speech on the eve of the war. And it does invoke history going back 1,000 years, and Crimea as the kind of cradle of the Orthodox religion, and, one people, one language, one culture, and torn apart by malevolent external forces and so forth. So I mean, nobody knows, because our actual clinical contact with him has been very limited. But on the other hand, we do have some historical
yes,
record.
we do, and we're just really kind of familiarizing ourselves with it now in a way that even a month ago, most of us were not very familiar with. And
the other thing is that, one thing that I've learned, and this is partly from interacting with my friend and colleague Katya Drozdova, who's an expert in Russian security matters, is how someone like Putin, you'd find this interesting from a clinical perspective, operates in a multi-layered fashion, right? So it's kind of like the Matryoshka dolls, that are nested and layer upon layer. So Putin cloaks himself in being the defender of the Orthodox Church, which resonates with his base, which is rural and less educated and older and so forth and so on. But at the same time, has a Machiavellian idea about enhancing his personal wealth and holding power, and then also has geopolitical concerns, right? So all of those things are kind of mashed up in one kind of world historical figure, and so the cultural complexes, as you said, I mean, politicians use psychological phenomena. He's using cultural the energy around cultural complexes for all kinds of reasons, including very instrumental, like, I want to have more money personally, or a bigger boat or whatever. I mean, I wonder what you think about that from a
Well,
psychological.
I think everything you say is what's emerging now in our understanding of who Putin is, and I totally agree with you that that ranting speech has given us an insight into how he may in fact really be thinking, that is kind of a revelation to us. And I have mentioned to you in separate conversation how Robert Lifton, who's probably the most renowned student of these kinds of phenomena of totalitarianism and the horrors that are done in the name of that, has just written a fabulous article on Putin's embrace or apparent taking on this philosopher, Ilyin, Russian philosopher who lived in exile much of his life, who was really a Russian Christian mystic, and that Putin has really adopted his philosophy as apparently the primary justification and rationale for what he's doing. And at the core of that, here's where the cultural complex comes in, John. At the core of that is the sacred nature of the Russian land, which was fragmented, and the role of the leader is to reunite this Christian, Orthodox Christian, Russian people into one. That's the core value. That's where we showed in the other image, the American flag with all the candles and stuff. That's the core value that needs to be protected, and in the name of which massive assault is launched on the rest of the world in the name of defending. You see, that's where archetypal defenses comes in. It's in the name of defending the holiest, most sacred value of the people. And as you said, maybe that audience, the collective psyche or the cultural complex that he's speaking to, is in the rural, older Russian people. That speaks to them. That's the potency, the emotional potency that fuels and gives energy to the complex and allows Putin to wage this unbelievably destructive war. So that at the core of at least his rationale and maybe his deep belief is this fundamental Christian mystical idea of Russia as the Holy Land.
And also, Lifton wrote a great book called Revolutionary Immortality, which traced Mao's psychological rationale for triggering the Cultural Revolution, because he was getting old, saw the end of his life, decided to identify with young people, triggered this young person's, turn everything upside down revolution that was ultimately ill-starred, but came from Mao's desire, in a sense, for immortality by living through the lives of young people. And Putin is, maybe not as old as Mao was when he kind of went off the deep end, but he's getting up there. I mean, he's close to 70, if not around 70 now.
I think it's 67. It's just a random number that sticks in my mind. Maybe I'm right.
Right, of course, he's still a young guy, right? But there undoubtedly have to be some personal motivations around legacy and around feeling his power, and not just feeling his power by being on a yacht somewhere, but feeling his, he's always been this hyper masculine guy who rides bareback on horses and stuff, and now this is a kind of, I mean, at a individual level, there I think feels to me like a bit of a aging machismo kind of dynamic going on. Well, okay, so
let me just add one piece to that, because what you're in a psychological, another psychological language, you could say that Putin's personal complexes, his deep fear and resentment of invasion from the West, his own personal family's experience in Leningrad and in the siege of Leningrad. There are all sorts of personal things which one could think of as Putin's personal complexes. And what becomes interesting from my point of view is the dovetailing of the personal complex with the cultural complex. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So I think we're getting somewhere in terms of understanding what's energizing the conflict from the Russian perspective. What we haven't yet talked about is what's going on the Ukrainian side. And I really like what and was intrigued by what you said about this is Russia versus the West, with China kind of hovering in the background. I mean, China has its own cultural complex around being the middle kingdom and about also having been behind the eight ball for a long time and now emerging as, about to become the #1 economy and, an exemplar of Confucian or neo-Confucian civility and so forth and so on. So that's a interesting thing to look at. But here we have Zelensky, who through force of personality, but also the perceived righteousness of his cause, mobilizing the entire West in really interesting and multi-layered ways. And, you kind of look at this cluster of Western values, freedom, justice, empowerment of the individual, democracy, and so forth and so on. And that is a potent stew as well, not to take anything away from the righteousness of the Ukrainian cause or the righteousness of those values, but it is, it takes two to tangle, so to speak, right? And there isn't the symmetry of Bush and Osama bin Laden here. I mean, it's clear that one side kind of attacked the other and they're defending themselves and so forth and so on. But for our purposes, we're interested in what is energizing the cultural complexes that are kind of a subtext to the meat and potatoes, military battlefield stuff and, who's going to win and so forth and so on. So what are your thoughts about the Ukrainian side and the kind of relational aspect of the two sets of complexes?
Yeah. I think in any time cultural complexes get activated, one side becomes the aggressor and the other side sees itself as the victim. Although actually in this cultural complex, Russia sees itself as the potential victim and therefore becomes the aggressor, so that there is a kind of symmetry, although it's not exactly the same, but there's a symmetry. In terms of, I mean, if you listen to all or parts of Zelensky's address to the Congress, which was just yesterday, first of all, he's a master at activating, if you will, although we don't tend to think of our core beliefs as being the stuff of cultural complexes, because we live in it and it's our own. But of course, it is a cultural complex, if you will, which is about freedom and democracy, and particularly our history begins in a revolution against a kingdom, against autocracy, and actually in the global scheme of things, and it's happening in the United States as we are all witnessing, there's a terrific fight between what's identifying itself as the forces of democracy and what certainly appears to be the forces of autocracy and totalitarianism, although the people who, from my point of view, seem to be more on the side of autocracy and totalitarianism, see themselves as fighting for freedom.
And have appropriated the imagery and the rhetoric and so forth and so on. So you have all of those pseudo patriots at the insurrection and, self-righteous right-wing people.
But I do think what we've witnessed in the Ukrainian people, which is quite amazing, because actually their history of democratic processes is only 30 years old. So they're very, very new. And I think one of the reasons that they're so inspiring to the West and Zelensky's so inspiring, they're a young democracy and Zelensky's a young guy in a t-shirt, as you point out. So he represents youth and authenticity. And he's a master of playing that. And I think it re-energizes our own sense of origins in terms of a revolution and fighting for freedom. So he activates our long memory of our being, of having had to fight for the values of freedom and democracy. So that goes back how many years it goes back 300 years or so. So he's activating deep complexes in the Western world about the history of freedom and the wonderful ideas of the Enlightenment and what the individual would be capable of in a free and democratic society. Those are very deep values, and they're very different from the values that core values that Putin represents.
Yeah, there was one guy, American, who went over to the Ukraine to fight, and he was interviewed and said, "I'm going because it's 1776 over there," right? And then the other thing that strikes me is it's also 1941, right? So it's or early 1942. Well, it's 1941 in the sense of America beginning to help Europe, and then ultimately 1944 and D-Day and all the good war and so forth and so on. So now we're helping Europe because Ukraine is European, and we're helping, in a way, helping them against the earlier forces of totalitarianism in terms of how it's put together. And then the other thing, which I think is super interesting, is the complex around youth, if we can call it that. I last night I watched the first episode of Servant of the People, which is Zelensky's comedy series, where he plays a teacher who becomes president of the country. And he's a very talented performer. If you haven't seen him on Dancing with the Stars, I mean, he's pretty unbelievable. But he's also a really good actor and an entertainment entrepreneur in the past. But the thing that really struck me about this episode was, as a teacher, he has a very close relationship with his students, and his students are actually the ones who encourage him to run, because they for the first time expose him to the idea that he could win, because their parents all think Zelensky is a plausible candidate. And they also instigate a crowdfunding initiative, which gets him the 2 million, whatever the Ukrainian currency is, fee, so that he can throw his hat in the ring. And other people can't believe it, because of course you just get that under the table from some corrupt influencer. But here it's like the young people who are encouraging him and funding him. And so there's this whole archetype of people under the age of 30, the young, who have never known the Soviet Union, have never known the Soviet, whatever they call it, Republic of the Ukraine, are able to fly to Europe, with low cost airfares, and have the access to the internet, and from an externalities point of view, are not that dissimilar from people under 30 in many other countries, right? And so this is fuel for that whole notion that we want our freedom, we want our democracy, we want our independence, and so forth and so on. So a lot of different feeders into the energy here.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. It had not occurred to me until you mentioned to me in a previous conversation that most of the young people of Ukraine never experienced the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union. They grew up in a society struggling to define itself as democratic, and so they're imbued with that idea, and there's tremendous energy in that. When I was working out sort of my notion of the cultural complex as it expressed itself in the Osama bin Laden Bush conflict, I was trying to define some of the characteristics of our American cultural complex, and at the top of the list was speed, height, youth, a profound belief in progress, and of course an open and democratic society. But so I agree with you, this notion of youth and height and speed and openness that's a very potent energetic force, and clearly something that Putin did not have a feel for, because if the Ukraine is moving towards the future in its youthful expression of the democratic experience and experiment, it feels like Russia's moving backward towards an idea of the old empire, which no longer really seems, at least, to be in tune with the direction the world is going, or at least the direction we hope it's going.
Well, it's an impossibility. I mean, you can't imagine a return to the Russian Empire in terms of just plain geography, because those societies have all moved on. The other thing that's interesting about this moving into the future versus the past is the media component of this, in the sense that Putin has shut down most internet media, and what's left is state-run television. There's no independent television in Russia either. And when you think about television, that's a very 1950s top-down, centralized medium, right? Which is ideal for propaganda and for promulgating cultural complexes, now that we've learned about them in this conversation. You know, in the 50s, we were happy to have Walter Cronkite explain the news to us because we trusted him. Now we have an analogous situation in the Russia of 2022, where state-run media is controlling the narrative rigidly. I mean, the only place I think right today where you can get contrary information, if I understand the situation correctly, is via Telegram, which has become another kind of Twitter-like platform for internet kind of information. And on the other side, you have 21st century media, which is basically the decentralized, bottom-up, million points of light internet media. So you get your news from many different sources, which is both complex, but also requires critical thinking and requires an ability to form a picture of what's going on, and is inherently democratic. I mean, you have to filter out a lot of the garbage, and you know, we hope that our great internet companies are going to have even more of a handle on fake news and you know, internet trash. But for all of its faults, it's a totally different way of understanding reality. And so you think about the cultural complex as refracted through media, centralized Stalinist television media, 1950s media versus 2022, you know, youth-oriented, decentralized internet media. They're different vehicles for conveying the energy of what we've been talking about, which are these cultural complexes. It seems to me, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John. And let me just go back slightly and then respond to that, because what I want to say about the cultural complex theory is what we're trying to do is get a glimpse of the collective psyche, if you will, of different parts of the world, different groups of people. And to do that, you need to be open to history and to sociology and to psychology and to economics and to politics. They all play into this complex idea about cultural complexes, the goal of which is to understand something about the psyche of any given group of people or individuals and how that interacts with the psyche of other individuals and groups of people. That's kind of the goal of this. Now, about that really good point about the uses of the media in these two different cultures right now, I'll flip that over and say that for many people, the world has gotten far too complex. And if you go into a grocery store and want to get a box of cereal, unless you know your brand, or a peanut butter, because I like peanut butter, I'm overwhelmed by, I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but the choices are overwhelming, just as the choices for what TV we watch and what opinions we listen to and who we believe. And so in the multiplicity of points of view in an open and free and democratic society, people can begin to feel overwhelmed and want a return to simplicity and to a simple point of view that's promulgated by a powerful leader. And one of the reasons I think we're having the conflicts we are in the United States in terms of cultural complexes is it's a split between those who believe in multiculturalism and multiplicity and multiple ways of understanding things and delight and swim in all of that, and those who are overwhelmed by it and want things to be distilled down to some very basic, simple beliefs as carried by a leader who is strong.
Yeah, so we're having a little bit of what we've been talking about playing out on the stage of our own country. It would seem, you know, that whole kind of youth diversity, older, centralized, complex, simple. It's a very interesting observation about being future focused versus being legacy focused. And it's partly it's generational. I mean, all the sociological studies show that if 30-year-olds were the only members of the voting public, we'd have a totally different country. And that's unfortunately, it reminds me of what we used to say at Harvard Business School about how you make change in academia, which is one death at a time. So this generational transition is part of bringing a new kind of cultural lens to things.
Yes, well, you might take that attitude, one death at a time, as something that might apply to our current political situation as well. We have the fantasy, at least, that if Putin weren't there, it would be a very different place. Or if Trump weren't there, it would be a very different place. That's probably a simplistic fantasy because they represent very powerful forces in the collective psyche as well as in the economy. Anyway, yeah.
And also just look at, the faces of the Facebook of our Congress, and anyway, enough said. So we have a few minutes left, and I wonder if we can turn our focus to what the implications of this knowledge might be. I mean, I know that you've said to me before that the goal here is not to quote unquote solve problems, but obviously all of us have a big vested interest in trying to figure out how to resolve conflicts, restore peace, reconcile different points of view, et cetera. And, clinicians want to do that for their patients and, for the relational dilemmas that come up. And this is a relational dilemma writ large. So what can we say about how this knowledge and these insights can be helpful in terms of the more pragmatic questions of conflict resolution and finding peace?
Yes, well, that's the $64 billion or trillion dollar. It's a $64 trillion question, and I would not pretend to have any kind of definitive answer. In the article that I just read by Robert Lifton, he makes a very interesting point that if we can understand the totalism of what he calls the totalism of Putin's psychology, which is built around this core belief of this kind of unified Russian empire to which he wants to devote his remaining energies. Lifton says if you understand something of the nature of Putin's psychology and the collective psychology of Russia that he's speaking to, then you need to offer him some sort of off-ramp that allows him to believe, I think, that he's at least accomplishing something in regard to that underlying core belief that he has. That if you simply stiff him and say, no, 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 you're just going to activate what I call his archetypal defenses of the collective spirit, and he's just going to stiffen. So in a negotiation, I think if you have skillful people who are actually aware of the cultural complexes of the people they're dealing with, as George Kennan advised when the Soviet Union collapsed, he said it's going to be a grave mistake for the United States or for NATO to go east, because you're going to play into the core complex, if you will, of the Russians about the fear of invasion from the West, for which there's ample history. You're making a huge mistake. And a lot of people feel that we made a huge mistake in wanting to expand NATO. If you had some deeper awareness of the cultural complexes that motivate the Russian people, and they had some understanding and appreciation for us that was not simply based on the dissolution of humankind in the West or whatever, maybe then if you have skillful negotiators who have some deep appreciation for these complexes, there may be room to understand one another and make skillful interventions. That's sort of the best I can do. You probably can do better than I.
Well, hardly, but yeah, I mean, the caveat here is that this knowledge is not doesn't come with a toolbox for fixing big problems, but insight is often how you get openings to actually be able to think about interventions or think about facilitation or negotiation in different ways. And I was intrigued by your use of the word stiffening because you see Putin talking now about how any dissenters in Russia are thugs and scum. I mean, literally using words like that. And so, he's being pressed at home. It's impossible to ignore the debris of, what he's caused on the home front. And so, one road is to say, oh, I empathize with the mothers of the fallen soldiers and with all the people who now no longer have an economic life, and I'm going to do something about it. And the other is to stiffen up and say, screw you. I mean, I'm right and you're wrong, and you don't matter and I matter. And so, part of, I guess, the dilemma here or the challenge is how to almost diffuse, it's how do you pierce that personal complex and let some of the air out so that there is flexibility. And it's sad to think about tens of thousands of lives lost because of satisfying someone's ego. But on the other hand, that is in some respects what's on the table, right? Because if there's a way to make Putin feel like he's gotten some of what he dreamt of in terms of the greater Russia and security and confirmation of the righteousness of his regime, then that may be the avenue for compromise. But it does seem right now like that zone of mutual interest is pretty tiny at best. But maybe understanding the issues from a psychological point of view, because satisfying psychology is often different from negotiating specific terms around, security guarantees and, no-fly zones and things of this kind.
Yeah, I have no pretense to understanding the complexity of those negotiations. What I do know in working with individuals for 50 years is that change is usually slow and unpredictable if it occurs at all. People love to use the word transformation, both as applied to the individual psyche and then to whole nations. And the transformation of the individual psyche and the transformation of the collective psyche is very hard won, very unpredictable. And once the ball gets rolling on these kinds of things, there's kind of an inexorable momentum that they're just going to keep going. And that's really what we're wrestling against. And I think that's what Biden is wrestling with. Are we going to let this thing get out of control? Because it could be horrific. And so I suspect that that Biden understands that if we push Putin too hard, like on the no-fly zone,
he'll stiffen up.
It'll stiffen up. That's it. He'll stiffen up. Yeah.
Yeah. The way that things are going on the battlefield now, it's the irresistible force meeting the immovable object in some respects, because the fact that all these civilians are being killed now, which is just unbelievably horrible. I think on the Russian side, that's a lever for forcing a negotiation in their favor. And the stiffening on the Ukrainian side is, well, with all this blood that's been shed, we can't back down. Yeah. And we have to go for what we want as a sovereign nation, right? So that creates, I think, the painfulness of the dilemma, because every day that conflict is being energized by human lives. And so in some respects, I think, unfortunately, the way this is going to work itself out is in terms of how the brute force of the military campaign plays out. And there's ample evidence right now that Russia is getting its ass kicked.
I see. So do you think that the sort of the slightly optimistic word that came out yesterday about the negotiations, there's actually some room for they seem to be making some headway in the negotiations between the Russians and Ukrainians. You think that's not, we shouldn't pay much attention to that? Or
no, I think the negotiations are happening, and it would be great to have a ceasefire, although ceasefire is often a synonym for rearm or regroup to fight better, because the Russians have not fought particularly well. And on the Ukrainian side, it's let's get some more of those javelins and some more of those advanced surface-to-air systems in place and evacuate our wounded. So I think the jury is out for sure. And it is, I think this is going to be decide. I think the negotiations are going to reflect the conditions on the battlefield. And it's in everyone's interest in the West for the Ukraine to, I mean, someone said to me the other day, who's a smart military strategy person, that Ukraine wins by not losing.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, that makes real sense to me, particularly with the economic sanctions, and between the economic sanctions and the Ukrainians actually being able to hold their own really shifts the whole equation. It must. Of course, then the danger is that Putin just calls in more mercenaries or whatever, because he's not going to,
right. War is one of humanity's favorite drugs. And unfortunately, we don't really know how to go into detox that readily. But the stakes couldn't be higher for more understanding and for more skill. And I think on that sobering note, we've learned so much from you, Tom. So can't thank you enough for taking the time. I think what I'll do is I'll post some of the references in the accompanying notes to the video when it gets posted, because it's almost like there's a valuable bibliography in terms of your work and in terms of some of the current events materials that I think people would love to find in all one place. Is there anything you'd like to say by way of conclusion? Not that we can put a button on this, but.
Well, what I'd like to say is what a thoughtful and intelligent person you are, and how much I enjoy the exchange with you, because we can. These are not easy conversations, and you're remarkably fluid and adept and thoughtful, and so I thank you very much.
Well, we did a good dance together, and to be continued. So with that, thank you very much, and I will bring this latest session of Intersections to a close.